Deleuze, as I was saying, was asked in an interview how he differed from Foucault, and he said that Foucault's main concern was with power, and whereas that had been the case with Deleuze, his main concern was with desire, studying forms of desire. And of course, we note that an assemblage is a principle of connectivity, the way that one multiplicity connects to another to form larger assemblages, larger and larger assemblages, is of course an erotic principle in the larger sense of the term. So he's fascinated with how things connect together to form different kinds of assemblages that construct, eventually that will construct on what he calls the plane of organization. So there will also be two large metaphysical principles here, what he calls the plane of consistency versus the plane of organization. The plane of consistency is the plane of consistency of multiplicities. And it is the realm, it is the rhizomatic realm of multiplicities, and they're consistent because every multiplicity fills its dimensions completely. And multiplicities, when their dimensions are increased, their dimensions can be increased, and they can be connected in any number of ways. Their dimensions can be increased, but eventually what will form is a plane of organization, and the plane of organization is the realm of law. It's transcendent, whereas the plane of consistency is immanent. It's the realm of law and organization of hierarchically organized state apparatuses that overcode the plane of consistency, the rhizomatic world. And so these are two different principles, but in this chapter he's concerned primarily with understanding the metaphysics of the plane of consistency of multiplicities. And then so the first principle then is that of connection, where rhizomes have no beginning and no ending, and they have multiple points of entry. You can enter a rhizome at any point or exit it at any point, and it's not something that's ever finished. Fragmentation is another principle of the rhizomatic point of view. Rhizomatic narratives such as Kafka's novels, which are left unfinished, or the cut-up novels of William Burroughs, or the type of nonlinear language of James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake. These are all examples of rhizomatic approaches to literature, and so fragmentation is of the essence of this. And then, so the second principle is that of heterogeneity. So what is connected can be two completely different multiplicities, two completely different things. And he gives one example he gives is how the orchid and the wasp connect together to form a rhizome by virtue of the fact that what an orchid will do is to create an image in its petals that resembles a wasp, or it may be a bee, a wasp or a bee, and it resembles it, and as the result of that it attracts the wasp. The wasp sees it and thinks that it's going to have a sexual mate, and so it's been tricked, and meanwhile as it lands on the orchid, it picks up pollen from the orchid, then it carries that pollen off to the female reproductive organs of another orchid. So there you have an example of a rhizome that is connected by these two multiplicities to form this assemblage, and it's an example of what he calls aparallel evolution, and a phenomenon of what he also calls deterritorialization and reterritorialization, such that the orchid manages to deterritorialize the wasp by making it part of its own reproductive apparatus. The wasp thereby then attempts to reterritorialize the orchid by mating with the image and then carrying off the pollen and so forth. So you have an example of a rhizome where you have a kind of becoming wasp of the orchid and a becoming orchid of the wasp. So this is an example of a rhizome. Another example he gives is where he says that there are certain types of viruses connect human beings to the animal world laterally. There are viruses, he says, that will take genetic information from baboons and insert them into cats and vice versa, so that the virus acts as a means of rhizomatic connection, that is to say a lateral connection on the horizontal plane between baboons and cats. Viruses connect us, human beings, likewise rhizomatically to other animals. He says that we've been done in more often through history by these rhizomatic viruses than we have been by genetically inherited illnesses, which is arborescent and genealogical. So swine flu and avian flu, these are means of rhizomatically connecting the human being with other animals. And the rhizome will introduce molecular elements that can destabilize and disrupt the formation of higher, more organized arborescent structures, can bring them crumbling down. It occurs to me when I was reading this too that one of the means where French thought itself is rhizomatic, that the very way that it proceeds is that these philosophers are all sort of rhizomatically interconnected with each other. Foucault and Deleuze are rhizomatically connected. They cross-fertilize each other's works. Badiou is rhizomatically connected with Deleuze insofar as he borrows from him the event ontology from difference in repetition. Virilio is rhizomatically connected with Deleuze in terms of the discussion of nomadology and the application of the politics of speed and dromology. And so they all cross-fertilize each other, and in order to understand French philosophy, you have to read a lot of these guys to see how they interconnect, and they all form this vast, large rhizome, which brings into question power structures and is very anti-authoritarian, anti-bourgeois, anti-convention. Whereas, by contrast, I think German thought proceeds in an arborescent genealogical manner. Each German philosopher, in order to understand a German philosopher, you have to understand the philosophers that came before him. In order to understand Nietzsche, you have to know something about Schopenhauer, who was the generation before him. In order to understand Schopenhauer, you have to know something about Kant. They precede each other in a very genealogical manner, and each one of these philosophers is a sort of self-contained world unto himself, a center, what they call here, D&G call a pivotal unity. A tree is a pivotal unity in a rhizome. It can be surrounded by a rhizome of plants, and the tree is a pivotal unity there. So it's an interesting contrast, I think, between the two approaches to thinking. So those are the first two principles of the rhizome, and the third principle they list here is that of multiplicity. And as I've already said, the basic ontology here is composed of multiplicities, and multiplicities intersect and they sort of weave together. Multiplicities weave together to form these vast sort of tapestries, these a-centered, asubjective, desubjectified tapestries where everything is interconnected with everything else. It's a little bit like Gebser's idea of the magical consciousness structure, where he had said that in the magical consciousness structure everything is interconnected with everything else in a woven manner. But I think that's about the only characteristic the two ideas have in common. I wouldn't say that the rhizomatic idea is magical in any other way beyond the fact that it connects everything to everything else in a lateral, horizontal manner that can undermine arborescent hierarchical structures, bring them toppling down. And this brings us to the fourth principle, which is the principle of asignifying rupture. If you damage a hierarchy or an arborescent model, such as some form of state apparatus, and you break a constitutive part of it, you can cause the whole thing to come tumbling down. If you damage part of a rhizome, it'll simply create a new line of flight and reorganize itself elsewhere, exactly like in the case of ants. If you wipe out an ant line, it simply reforms itself elsewhere. So rhizomes cannot be destroyed easily. Animals form rhizomes in the case of wolf packs or rats. These are non-hierarchical structures, rhizomatic structures of swarms. And so this is the principle of asignifying rupture, and also the fact that central to this idea is that the rhizome can trace what Deleuze and Guarttari call a line of flight. A line of flight is central to their concept of deterritorialization. So the concept of deterritorialization is important to understand first, I think. Deterritorialization is what happens when a multiplicity is recoded with a different set of functions than what it was originally designed to do in a different context. So we can say that the hand, for example, is a deterritorialized paw. It was originally designed to grasp branches, but with the making of tools, it's been deterritorialized and then reterritorialized to form something else. Or you can say that the mouth and the teeth and the lips were originally territorialized for language, or for eating and consuming, but then they become deterritorialized and reterritorialized to create language. And the deterritorialization process then is a sudden swerve or rupture that ends up in creating new lines of segmentarity that break off from an oppressive, overcoding, dominating regime of one sort or another. A good example of this might be some of the countercultural phenomena. For example, think of the Z-Boys, the skateboarders in Venice Beach, who deterritorialized the surfboard and reterritorialized it into skateboards, and in doing so traced a creative line of flight that evaded capture of the dominating codes of the mainstream society. So the tracing of a line of flight by the rhizome is a creative act that evades capture by overcoding systems, dominator systems. And so that's the principle of A signifying rupture. And then they move on into the idea of cartography versus decalcomania. Decalcomania was something that was developed in art history that has to do with tracings. You make a tracing of something, an engraving or a print, and you transfer it to, let's say, a pottery. So the word decal is related to this. So that forms a tracing. And what he wants to do here is, with the principle of cartography versus decalcomania, is that the principle of cartography, rhizomes create maps. And a map is always unfinished, and you can enter the map at any point. It doesn't have a single privileged point of entry or exit, egress. You can enter it at any point, and it's never finished. It's always subject to revision. It can always be remade, recoded, extended, amplified, edited. That's a map. A tracing, on the other hand, once you trace it, it's a finished product. It's something that is not subject to revision, and he says that the Freudian approach, for example, to psychotherapy is arborescent. It's a center-periphery model that uses tracings in the form of, let's say, the idea of the phallus, the idea of the mother. They're preset, preformed categories that are imposed upon the unconscious, to which Freud acts as the general, the Herr Director of the process. He's the central authority figure. This is all an anti-authoritarian system, remember. And so he's a center of power, an authoritarian symbol at the center of psychoanalysis. And so the whole thing comes out of this imposition of these tracings. They say, D&G say that the tracing needs to be put onto the map, not the other way around. So the map is comprehensive enough, or rather flexible enough is a better word, to encompass the tracings. And their approach to, in Anti-Oedipus, to the unconscious had been that of schizoanalysis, where what you do is you map out the unconscious, and in mapping it out, you actually trace it. Or not trace it, but you construct and create the unconscious, and you have respect for the way that it wants to go, how it's laid out. Whereas Freud is always trying to redirect and rupture the lines of flight and the assemblages between the individual and the outer world, and to redirect them and recode them so that they're gradually stripped down and narrowed to a single center of function. And so that's the distinction between rhizomes construct maps that are always unfinished versus tracings, which are something that are always finished. And then so that's the final principle that they talk about. And so that's assemblages of enunciation versus the machinic assemblages. And that is the outline, the basic set of ideas that they begin this book with, the rhizome. And it's designed to be something that is absolutely anti-authoritarian. It's later picked up, it's a perfect metaphor to characterize the political left, because it deprivileges centers of authority, those who pretend to centers of command and centers of authority from which they can distribute their commands, and commands that demand obedience and compliance. It's very consistent with the political left, and of course the multiplicities of D&G become the multitudes in Hart and Negri's Empire, where they talk about the idea of multitudes rising to resist the overcodings of the empire, the World Trade Organization and the IMF, and the coding of the planet in terms of free trade agreements and so forth. So you can see how one of the reasons why Deleuze has become so popular is precisely, D&G rather, has become so popular, is because the metaphors that are chosen here are very consistent with leftist, anti-authoritarian, anti-hierarchical, a-centered, desubjectivized narratives. And the other thing too is that is the elimination of the subject. The subject is something that comes into being on the plane of organization. The plane of organization is signifying, and it's subjective, and it's where you get a subject of enunciation. Traditional ideas of discourse, they say, have this idea of a subject of enunciation. But on the plane of consistency, we have opposed to this. The subject is eliminated because the plane of consistency of multiplicities is asubjective. There is no central subject, and in place of that, we get collective assemblages of enunciation. Kafka, in their book on Kafka, is a manifestation of what they call a minor literature, and a minor literature is a literature that is motivated out of a collective assemblage of enunciation. Kafka becomes the mouthpiece for all the Prague Jews, and they resist the overcoatings of German dominance.